Welcome back, everyone, to the St. Paul's Ministry of Defense. Today we're going to be talking about the problem of miracles. So, where does this problem of miracles fit into the entire course of how to defend the Catholic Christian faith? What role does this play in this great endeavor of ours that we've embarked on this year? Well, remember that fundamental claim that I set out to make at the beginning of this year, that tripartite claim that God exists, has decisively revealed himself to mankind in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and is seeking intimacy with each and every one of us in the context of a personal love relationship. So if you notice, that second claim there is that Jesus is the decisive self-revelation of God. So at this point, we've talked extensively about the existence of God, right? In demonstrating that first claim there, we saw how God is the best explanation of three distinct data points of the human experience and observation of the universe and metaphysical reflection of reality. And then we saw how the chief reasons given to doubt God's existence, mainly from evil and suffering, ultimately don't work, right? Ultimately, they don't constitute a convincing enough case to doubt God's existence, especially given the weighty evidence in favor of his existence. So now we're going to spend the next 4 weeks, including this week, on that second claim, on the divinity of Jesus, on Jesus as the self-revelation of God himself. Now, there are two components of Jesus' divinity. There's two claims that are being made here. The first is that Jesus claims to be God, and the second is that that claim is verified by his resurrection from the dead. So Jesus claims to be God, and then he's resurrected from the dead, which serves as proof to the world that his allegedly blasphemous claims are indeed true. Now, what is the means that God uses to vindicate the words of Jesus? The resurrection, which is ultimately a miracle. But we live in this scientific age, right? Lots of people think religion is a thing of the past, it's a thing for pre-scientific people. We now live in a culture that actually understands, right, what fire is, right? We've put men on the moon. We've discovered particles that we can't even see. We've invented telephones and iPhones and electric cars and everything else. How can we be expected to believe in miracles, given how advanced our understanding of science is? And moreover, even if miracles are somehow possible, how could we say that a miracle actually ever happened, right? How could we ever identify a miracle? Aren't natural explanations to be preferred, right? Our experience 99.999% of the time, if not 100% of the time for most people, is the laws of nature working ordinarily, and the ordinary things of nature occurring and explaining why things happen. That's the overwhelming experience of being human as well. And so why would we then postulate this supernatural explanation for something that could be natural, right? So there are two problems here. There's one, the possibility of miracles, and then there's the identification of miracles. And we're going to talk about both today. So first, of course, we're going to spend the next little bit talking about miracles. We need to define them first. So for Aquinas, a miracle is an event that exceeds the productive power of nature. Another way of saying that is that a miracle is an event that would not have happened if there had not been something outside of the natural order interfering with the natural order, right? What are some common examples of miracles, right? Especially in the Bible. Well, let's say a parting of the sea, walking on water, turning water into wine, healing somebody who's been sick for decades in an instant. These are examples of things that cannot happen naturally or cannot happen physically, right? They needed to be explained by something that's outside of the universe if they were to have actually occurred, right? So we have this understanding kind of intuitively of what miracles are, but it's helpful to have the precise definition as you see on the screen. So there's some historical background of miracles, and this flows from the deist controversy. So the skepticism of modern man about miracles arises during the Enlightenment. And so thereafter, miracles become unbelievable for most of the intelligentsia, right? Your professors, your philosophers, your scientists. Ever since the Enlightenment, this belief in miracles, right, has subsided largely and has been replaced by a more naturalistic understanding of at least what's operating within the universe, right, irrespective of what may have caused it. And that'll be important for later on. People might be familiar with a famous story where Thomas Jefferson rewrites the Bible, right, and then produces what's been called the Jeffersonian Bible, where the miracle accounts are all written out because he doesn't expect them to be believed by a scientific people. Now, the attack against miracles was led by the deists. So deists are theists, right? Like the rest of us, they believe that God exists. But unlike the rest of us, they don't believe that God has revealed himself to mankind in any way. So if you are a religious theist, then you think that some revelation is true, right? Some religion is true. Either God has revealed himself to mankind in Moses, or in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, or in the prophet Muhammad, or something like that, right? So you have God and religion. But if you're a deist, you think God is the creator and designer of the universe, but then kind of wound up the universe and then let it go from there and then hasn't really interfered with creation at all, right? Hasn't reached out to mankind and communicated with us in any way. So basically, you can think of deism as God without any religion. And deists are the ones who attack the possibility and identification of miracles. And they're waging this war against the backdrop of Newtonian physics, right? There's this idea of the Newtonian world machine. So at the time, there's a revolution, right, in physics that's primarily led by Isaac Newton, who is himself a Christian. And of course, many of these Enlightenment thinkers were, but many of them wouldn't be Christian in the way that we would say so, right? Many of them wouldn't have been Orthodox. Now, in Newtonian physics, right, you have this idea of determinism. So in Newtonian determinism and in Newtonian mechanics, basically everything in the universe can be expressed and explained in the context of pushes and pulls, right, of mechanistic motions, right, of formulaic laws. So for Newton and followers in this physics tradition, if you had a perfect knowledge of the laws of nature and the current state of matter, right, at any given point, and you had a supreme intelligence, let's say, you could predict the future states of affairs at any other point, right, in the future, because they're going to be determined based on how the world works, right, the laws of nature, and then how the world is right now. You can know exactly how it'll be at any given point in the future. So it's this mechanistic picture of reality. It's this well-oiled machine, this functioning, self-sufficient machine that's referred to as the Newtonian world machine. Now, one of the reasons why the deists appealed to this machine and why they argued against miracles is because they thought that the best argument for God's existence was going to be the machine itself, right? The idea that the universe was self-sustaining and that it didn't need, right, that it worked, right, that it wasn't this broken kind of chaotic mechanism, but that it was functioning so well and so beautifully, so consistently, so breathtakingly uniform, that this clearly is an element of design. This cries out for an explanation. That explanation is going to be a transcendent intelligence that brought the universe into being and designed it according to reason. And so they thought that if you posited miracles, that if you posited that irregularities could occur, then basically what you're saying is that the machine can break, that it can be faulty, and that it can fail to provide a uniform experience. But then therefore you've not done some pious thing saying that miracles have worked. What you've actually done is you've undermined the case for God's existence. You've undermined the best reason that we have to affirm that God actually exists. And so they thought that actually the blasphemous thing to do would not to be to argue against miracles. It would be to posit the possibility of miracles. And so by contrast, they said that you can't have miracles. Now, with this Newtonian world machine, the need for God's providence is eliminated, right? I don't need to say that, okay, the world came into being because of God's careful hand guiding it, or mankind coming onto the scene because of something intentional, right, on God's part, everything can be contained by something in the system, right? The reason why the earth formed was because of the initial properties of the Big Bang combined with the laws of nature that would predicted the earth forming, right? And so you don't really need God in this picture, right, kind of intervening at every given moment or guiding it in any way. And so when the physicist Laplace comes to Napoleon and then describes this worldview to him, describes the Newtonian world machine to Napoleon, he doesn't mention God at all. And then Napoleon recognizes this, then asks, where does God fit into this picture? And then Laplace retorted, "Sire, I have no need of that hypothesis." So the need for God's providence is eliminated in this Newtonian physics picture. But to get concrete and to get specific, the leading opponent of miracles, right, of the Enlightenment, and by far the most important thinker for our investigation into miracles, would be that of David Hume. So he's a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. And he argues not against the possibility of miracles. Other people do that, like Spinoza. He argues instead against the identification of miracles. And his argument is a bipartite argument, so it has two parts to it. The first is an in-principle argument, which takes the form of an even if. So he says, even if one conceded that the evidence of a particular miracle amounted to, let's say, a proof, it is still in principle impossible to identify that event as a miracle, because your experience of the world, right, as uniform laws of nature, as ordinary, is going to drown out even the strongest, right, evidence for a miracle, because your experience is so vast and is so one out of one, right, the laws of nature and order, that at best it's going to be one against one, and you're going to get to 50%, and therefore you should be agnostic on the miracle. But, he's going to say, but in fact, the evidence for miracles does not amount to a full proof. Indeed, the evidence is so poor that it does not even amount to probability. So the argument takes the form of an even if you don't get to believe in miracles, but in fact, the evidence for the miracle is so bad that you should never believe in them. So it's an even if, but in fact argument. And we're going to address the in principle argument first, and then the in facts argument. But first we'll kind of briefly explain what he means by each. So in principle, miracles are by definition utterly improbable because they are contrary to the laws of nature. And so no evidence for a purported miracle can serve to overcome its intrinsic probability. We just described why, right? Because even if you get to 50-50, that's still going to lead you to, at best, agnosticism. But then he has his in facts argument, right? They don't even amount to probability. And then he gives 4 reasons why they don't. But in any case, he's going to say that the decisive weight falls on the side of the scale containing the full proof for the regularity of nature. So best case scenario for the theist, right? Let's say in principle, assuming they have the best evidence, you're going to get to 50-50, right? But you don't have good evidence, right, the theist, for a particular miracle. And so therefore you have something really small against, so let's say maybe a 0.18 against a 0.5 of the laws of nature and the regularity of the human experience. And so therefore it's going to drown that out. And so there's no case at all to believe in the miracle. But why does he think that the evidence for the miracles is so poor? Well, he's going to give 4 reasons why. So first, no miracle in history is attested by a sufficient number of educated and honest men who are of such social standing that they would have a great deal to lose by lying. Secondly, people crave the miraculous and will believe the most absurd stories. 3, miracles occur only among barbarous peoples. That's my favorite one. And 4, miracles occur in all religions and thereby cancel each other out. So because of these 4 considerations, it turns out that there's actually not any powerful reason to believe in any miracle. But again, even if you did have powerful reason to believe in it, you have an even more powerful reason to doubt it, namely our uniform experience of the regularity of nature and the experience of all men before that time. And so Hume, in a more arrogant moment of his, writes, "The Christian religion not only was at first attested with miracles, but even at this day cannot be believed by any reasonable person without one. Mere reason is insufficient to convince us of its veracity, and whoever is moved by faith to assent to it is conscious of a continued miracle in his own person, which subverts all the principles of his understanding and gives him a determination to believe what is most contrary to custom and experience. So, in other words, Hume is saying that the true miracle is that anybody is stupid enough to believe in Christianity. So, he's that confident in his arguments against miracles. So, now let's weigh them against the bar of reason and let's see if they really do hold water. But first, we're going to tackle the argument against the possibility of miracles before we get into Hume's argument against the identification of miracles, where we'll address both the in principle and in facts argument. So for the one who's arguing against the possibility of miracles, what he's saying is that miracles are impossible because they're violations of the laws of nature. And so no miracle has ever occurred, nor will one ever occur. By contrast, the argument against the identification of miracles, this person is going to say, a person arguing in this line of reasoning, will grant that even if miracles are metaphysically possible, it would be impossible to ever identify them, right? Because again, natural explanations are always going to be preferred in this way of thinking. And so no event can ever be established as miraculous. So notice the difference there. The one is saying miracles can never happen. The other is saying we can never classify an event as a miracle, even if it actually was one. So first, let's attack that argument against the possibility of miracles. So there's going to be basically three major theories of the laws of nature. And we're going to show that on none of these theories, right, would miracles properly be classified as violations of the laws of nature. So the first is actually Hume's own view of the laws of nature, and this is called the Humean regularity view. Now, on this view, the laws of nature aren't really laws, they aren't prescriptions. They're just descriptions of the way things happen. So they just describe the regularity that we observe in nature. But if this is the case, right, if L, which we're going to use to denote the laws of nature, if L just describe what happens, then the miracle cannot be incompatible or a violation because the miracle would just be included in what happens. Right? If all the laws of nature are just descriptions of what happens, then if a miracle happened, it would just be added into the description. Right? So this isn't going to be a violation, properly speaking, on the Humean regularity view of nature. What about on the second view of the laws of nature, called the gnomic necessity view? So in this view, right, it's going to be natural laws are stronger than on the Humean regularity view. They're not merely descriptive, they're also prescriptive, telling us what can and cannot happen in the world, right, specifically with respect to counterfactuals. So a counterfactual is like an if-then statement, right? So if the world was like this, then this could or could not happen. Right? So for example, if the rate of expansion of the universe was slightly greater, then the universe would have contracted on itself, right? So something like that would be an instance of gnomic necessity. Now, again, it doesn't seem like miracles are going to be properly classified as violations of the laws of nature on this view. Because at the end of the day, on this view, the laws of nature are universal inductive generalizations. They're going to be based on experience. And so if that's the case, if they're going to be universal, then they must take into account everything that happens in the world. And so they would be revised should an otherwise impermissible event occur. Then you in fact realize that those weren't actually the laws of nature, and then you rediscover what the real ones actually were. Now the third view is going to be the causal disposition view. And this is the idea that things in the world have different natures or essences, which include their causal dispositions to affect other things in specific ways. So for example, you might say that salt has the natural disposition to dissolve in water, right, or preserve meat. And so on this view, the laws of nature are necessary truths about what causal dispositions are possessed by the various kinds of natural things, right? And these are dictated by their essences, right? So it's not going to be something over and above like an umbrella. It's going to be something on the ground, grounded in the individual essences of those things. So it's part of what it means to be salt, that it has the property of dissolving in water. But on this view, right, in no way can miracles be conceived of as violations, because right? Even if a supernatural agent like God prevents a grain of salt from dissolving in water, it still holds true that salt has the active disposition of dissolving in water, right? So then the law isn't going to be violated here, right? That still holds true that salt has that disposition. So it seems that on none of these views, right, are miracles going to be properly regarded as violations of the laws of nature. So we can understand miracles, right, as physically impossible events which cannot be produced by natural causes, right? Very similar to what we talked about at the beginning. And it seems kind of implicit too in the laws of nature that they're basically saying, okay, these phenomena are going to happen or these phenomena are happening, right, all else held equal. So they're precluding the possibility, or not the possibility, they're precluding the actuality of divine intervention, right? So they're not even talking about all the things that would happen. They're talking about all the things that would happen naturally. So there's a natural assumption there, but it's not a naturalistic one. And so why would we think that supernatural causes should be precluded, right? Why should we think that the only forces operating in the universe or in reality are those of the universe, are natural laws and natural phenomena, right? In fact, in a theistic world, the laws of nature find their ultimate, if not proximate origin, in the creator and designer of the universe, right? And so the same God who could create the entire universe out of nothing could easily, for example, right, create the genetic material necessary for a virgin birth, right, or could cause water to turn into wine. Right, many philosophers regard the laws of nature as contingent, right, the idea that they could have been different than they actually are. But regardless, the burden of proof would be on the skeptic who claims that an omnipotent being, a being that's literally all-powerful, right, could not affect such a change, because it seems that that is going to be in this power of omnipotence, that is going to be in the realm of possibility, right? Possibility is always the default. If anyone makes a claim contrary to possibility and saying necessity in one way or another, then that's the person who's going to have the burden of proof in any debate. But then even intuitively, right, it would be absurd to say that the same being who brought the universe into being out of nothing would be unable to turn water into wine or create the genetic material necessary for a virgin birth, right? So it seems that if God is strong enough to get the whole thing in motion, then he can affect certain things, right, and adjust his design in certain instances. That seems like that's going to be entirely within his power, right, as the creator of the universe and as an intrinsically omnipotent being. So now let's actually get into a critique of Hume, right, and Hume's principal argument against the identification of miracles. And then we'll end off briefly talking about his in fact argument against it. So fortunately, the in principle argument has been widely recognized by philosophers of science, mathematicians, and probability theorists to be mathematically fallacious, and demonstrably so. So let's give an example, right, of a very improbable event. So let's say that on the morning news, you hear that the pick in last night's lottery was 7492871. So this is a report of an extremely improbable event, right? The likelihood that that would be the winning number that's announced on the TV is very, very low, right? It's one out of several millions. And yet, that's the number that's announced, right? Now, even if the morning news' accuracy is 99.9%, the improbability of the event reported will swamp the probability of the witness's reliability, so that we should never believe such reports. In order to believe the report on Hume's view, he would require us to have enough evidence in favor of the morning news reliability to counterbalance the improbability of the winning pick, which is absurd, because then we wouldn't be able to believe, right, so many events of our experience, right, that we do end up believing based on reliable testimony. So William Paley famously observed that Hume's argument could lead us into situations where we could be forced to deny the testimony of even the most reliable witnesses, right? Like the newscast example. Moreover, if Hume's whole line of reasoning is correct, right, that all you need to consider is just how intrinsically likely something is, and that intrinsic likelihood is going to be based on your experience of the world, then he'd be led into a lot of disastrous consequences illuminated by thought experiments like that of the traveler's tales of ice. So, for example, imagine you conceive of a man who lives near the equator, right? And let's say this is a primitive man. He doesn't know about other places in the world. He doesn't have access to modern science. He's just in a tropical climate near the equator. And then somebody from Northern Europe travels to that region of the world and then tells him about ice and tells him that there exists somewhere else in the world solidified forms of H2O that are cold to the touch. Well, that person, according to Hume's model and Hume's view, shouldn't believe that person because the universal experience of his life and of all of his ancestors for centuries have been that water is not going to exist in a solidified state and that it's not going to be cold to the touch. And so Hume's view would also entail that the man in the tropics should disbelieve the traveler's tale, right? That he shouldn't actually believe his claim that ice exists. And that's a problem, right? That's clearly a problem because our intuitions so strongly suggest that that wouldn't be an insane thing for him to believe. So what's actually going on here, right? Why does Hume's view not make sense of our intuitions regarding the lottery ticket and regarding the traveler's tales of ice? Because Hume is making a mistake here. So probability theorists later on saw that what also needs to be considered, right, in addition to the intrinsic probability of an event, so probability of this event happening given everything we know about the world, right, that's the intrinsic probability, but what additionally needs to be considered is the probability that if the reported event has not occurred, then the evidence or the witness's testimony is just as it is. That's the second part of the equation. So to go back to the lottery example, you can't just look at the probability of, okay, that number getting picked, which is one out of millions and millions of numbers, right? You also have to assess the probability that the morning news would announce the pick as 7492871 if some other number had been chosen, right? And that probability is going to be incredibly small, right? Given that the newscasters had no preference for the announced number. So if the winning number wasn't actually 7492871, would the newscaster still have reported that and gone national with that as the winning number? Well, no, but yet they did report it that way. So then that would cast doubt on the idea that it's not that number, since that wouldn't predict that they'd announce it. But the announcement is much more probable if 7492871 was the actual number chosen, right? So that's clearly something that's relevant to this equation. And so the consequence of all of this is that other factors need to be included in the correct probability calculation of some improbable event. And just to give a quick example that's maybe more relatable, right, or more accessible at least, imagine a murder mystery case. So imagine you have a scenario where you have a murdered wife of a husband, right? The husband calls the police, says his wife has been murdered, and they arrive on the scene, right? And they start, right, cleaning everything up and then asking questions. And of course, they're trying to begin the investigation into who murdered the woman. Now, you might think, okay, well, what's our background knowledge, right, of the world, right? Prior to this event, what's our background knowledge? Well, let's say, for example, that they had a very outwardly loving marriage, right? The neighbors never heard them fight, right? They had been married for 40 years. They had just gone on a trip together and posted lots of smiling pictures on Facebook. The kids said they had a loving marriage their whole lives, right? The colleagues at work said they never complained about marriage, right? You take all these prior probabilities, right, into consideration here, or all these components that make up the prior probability of, for example, the husband being the murderer, and you're going to deduce that the prior probability is really low, right, given everything you know about the world. But, right, it would be faulty to then conclude, right, that therefore the husband isn't actually the murderer because the prior probability is so low. Is there any other evidence that ought to be considered here? It appears that there, at least in principle, can be. What if you then find out upon investigating that the husband had taken out a life insurance policy, right, a little bit before the murder had taken place? Or what if there was a leaked, right, accidental call to a family friend in which they were actually caught having a very vicious fight, right? What if the husband wanted to take control of different properties, right, that it was recently discovered that the woman had owned and then not disclosed to anyone else, right? And that those properties would go to him, right, if she died. And what happens also if the murder weapons, right, if the knives were investigated and they were found to contain the fingerprints of the husband, right? So all of a sudden now you have all this post-event evidence that makes it much more likely that he is the murderer, that event of the husband murdering their wife actually occurred. And so if you just consider the prior probability of this happening, of the husband being the murderer, maybe it would be really low. But then you consider all the evidence, right, that comes after the event, and then you know, okay, maybe it's not actually very low. So what's important is that you don't just consider the intrinsic probability of an event, you also have to consider the posterior probability, so both the prior and the posterior. And we want to make this move, right, from rare to improbable, right? Because this is basically what the people are saying, right? What Hume and the other skeptics are saying is that rare events are improbable. But rare events do, of course, occur. If all we know about event X is that it's rare, then it may be improbable against only the backdrop of the intrinsic probability. But again, we have to consider both the prior and the posterior probability. Now for Hume, the prior probability in assessing the resurrection is going to be the laws of nature. So just our uniform experience of how the world operates. And so then he's going to say, okay, well, given that, the resurrection is going to be very low. The problem is he doesn't consider any of the posterior probability, which is what we're going to get into now. So let's let E stand for evidence and then H stand for hypothesis. Now, when we talk about probabilities, we have a bar there in the middle of the two symbols, and how you read that is the probability of E given H, or E with respect to H, or E on H. Whenever we assess the probability of some event A, we always assess it given B, right, our knowledge of the world, or evidence, or something else. So it's always one thing given another thing, because things don't happen in a vacuum, right? Reality is a story of interconnectedness. So E is strong evidence for H if and only if the probability that you have E given H, so the probability that you'd have the evidence given the hypothesis, is greater than the probability that you'd have that evidence if the hypothesis wasn't true, right? That seems like common sense. So when the probability of the hypothesis is low, then the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis over the probability of the evidence given not the hypothesis needs to be high, right? If the probability of the hypothesis given the evidence is to exceed 0.5, right? Which is what we're going to need in order to classify something as a probable event. So that's just talking about hypothesis probabilities in general. Now let's get specifically into the resurrection. So in calculating the probability of the resurrection, we are going to introduce a number of symbols here. We'll let B stand for our background knowledge of the world. We'll let E stand for the specific evidences, right? So these will be things like the discovery of the empty tomb, like the postmortem appearances, like the sudden and sincere origin of the disciples' belief in the resurrection and everything else, right? And then R is, of course, going to be that hypothesis that Jesus was raised from the dead, or that God raised Jesus from the dead. So we're asking here for the probability of the resurrection given the background knowledge of the world and the specific evidences that we're confronted with. So given our background knowledge of the world, our knowledge of how the world works and everything we know about the world, and the evidences in front of us, what is the probability that the resurrection happened given those two things? Now, the probability of the resurrection, given the background knowledge of the world and the specific evidences, is going to be expressed by this complicated ratio. And we're going to walk through it one step at a time. So this first part of the numerator here is the probability of the resurrection purely on the background knowledge of the world, right? So that's going to be called the intrinsic probability of the resurrection. And then that's going to be multiplied by what's called the explanatory power, right, of the evidence for the resurrection. So again, the postmortem appearances, discovery of the empty tomb, sudden and sincere origin of the belief in the resurrection, everything else that we'll talk about in future sessions this semester. What is the probability that you would see that you would have that, given our background knowledge of the world and the resurrection? So basically, this is expressing the explanatory power of the resurrection hypothesis, right? So how good of a job does the resurrection hypothesis do of explaining the evidence that we have? I may have misspoken earlier. That's what that portion of the numerator is expressing. Now in the denominator, what we're going to do is simply reproduce the numerator in the denominator. So that's the first half of that expression there. And then we're going to assess the explanatory power of the hypothesis that Jesus was not raised from the dead. So basically, this is the explanatory power of all the naturalistic hypotheses and explanations of the evidence. So this is going to be the intrinsic probability that the resurrection didn't occur, right, given our knowledge of the world, multiplied by the probability of the evidence given our background knowledge of the world and the resurrection not occurring, right? So what's the likelihood, what's the probability that we have these evidences given our background knowledge of the world and the fact that the resurrection didn't occur, right? So probability theorists have devised this equation for assessing what's called the odds form of Bayes theory, right? For assessing complicated probabilities like this. So what we're going to try to do here is to show that the explanatory power of the naturalistic hypotheses or of any non-resurrection hypothesis is going to be incredibly small, right? Because what do we ultimately want to do here as Christians who are trying to demonstrate the truth of the central claims of Christianity to those who don't yet believe? Well, we're trying to show, of course, that the probability of the resurrection, which is with respect to the background knowledge of the world and the specific evidences, is very high. So we want this value here, right? We want this ratio to be overall as large as possible, right? To increase the chances of the resurrection. Now, what we want to do is minimize this second part of the denominator, because this whole equation, right, this whole ratio takes the form essentially of x over x plus y, because the numerator is reproduced. And so if you notice, as y tends towards 0, then the denominator is smaller than it otherwise could be, right? And of course, in fractions, right, we all remember this from second grade, the smaller the denominator, if you hold the numerator constant, the larger the fraction is going to be overall, right? The larger the ratio. Whereas if the larger the denominator, then the smaller the ratio is going to be. But that ratio is going to be the odds that the resurrection occurred, the probability that it occurred. But if the denominator is high, is large, then that means the overall probability that the resurrection occurred, at least the likelihood of it, is going to be low, because a large denominator equals a small number. And so the task here of the Christian apologist is to show that the explanatory power of the hypothesis that the resurrection didn't occur is very, very weak, such that that number is going to be very, very small, and so y is going to tend towards 0, and then the overall ratio is going to be larger. So we want to show that this second part of the expression here in the denominator is very, very slow, is very low. Now, first let's see where Hume's whole philosophy goes wrong. So Hume's philosophy goes wrong right? His egregious error is that he only considers that first part, right, of the numerator. He only considers the probability of the resurrection given our background knowledge of the world. He only considers the intrinsic probability of the resurrection. But as you can see, that's mathematically fallacious. There are other factors that need to be considered, right? Namely, what's the probability that you would see this evidence if the hypothesis was true, if the event, what did actually happen, versus the probability that, and in the context of a comparison to the probability that you'd have that evidence given that the event didn't occur, right? Again, going back to the lottery example, you can't just say that, oh, this number was picked out of millions of chances, that's an unlikely event, therefore we shouldn't believe it, right? We also have to ask, okay, would that number have been announced on national television if that wasn't actually the winning number, right? And then the probability there too. So he's forgetting all these other ingredients in the equation and only focusing on the intrinsic probability. Now this is important because even if the intrinsic probability of the resurrection is very low, right, even if the probability of R on B is low, that can be drained out, that can be swamped by the high and important force of the explanatory power of the resurrection, right? So if that first part of the numerator is really small, right, even granting that it's small, that second part of the numerator can be very large, right? The probability that we'd see this evidence given the background knowledge of the world and the resurrection could be very high, right? So that it would swamp the low intrinsic probability of the resurrection, especially when we see how that compares to the likelihood that you'd see the evidence given that the hypothesis of the resurrection is false, given that the resurrection didn't occur. So he's forgetting all these other ingredients. He's only focusing on just one. And so that's why people have regarded Hume's endeavor as an abject failure. But it gets even worse for Hume, because that's just assuming that the intrinsic probability of the resurrection, but it gets even worse for Hume, because that's just assuming that the intrinsic probability of the resurrection is very low. But why assume that, right? So let's investigate briefly the intrinsic probability of the resurrection. So relative to our background knowledge, is a miracle always more improbable than the miracles not occurring and the evidence is being as it is? So again, is the probability of the resurrection, given our background knowledge of the world, really that low? So Hume claims that the uniform experience of mankind supports the laws of nature rather than miracles. And so what does he mean by that? The philosopher of science, John Earman, interprets Hume to construe the intrinsic probability of a miracle in terms of frequency. So he's going to say that miracles are improbable because they diverge from mankind's uniform experience. Now, he can't say they diverge from, right, mankind's uniform experience, or else that would be question begging, because the miracle could be part of the experience, right? So what he basically means is that up until that point, right, we haven't seen anything like this. But the frequency model that he's positing here is inadequate, right? So for example, scientists have spent billions of dollars and invested thousands of man hours into trying to observe an event of proton decay. But we've never actually observed proton decay before. So on Hume's view, that whole undertaking would be a massive waste of time. It would be, in principle, a failure, because since we've never seen that before, we shouldn't expect to ever see it, right? If you're going to say that infrequency, right, means improbability, then a lot of our scientific projects would be an absolute waste. And of course, this view that everything has to be so standard and uniform is an unjustified assumption as well, right? Strange things do happen, of course. So let's actually assess properly the intrinsic probability of the resurrection by looking at the theorem of total probability. Now, how do we assess the intrinsic probability of a miracle M, right? Well, especially talking about the resurrection here. So it's going to be given, right, looking at our symbols, B is going to stand for the background knowledge of the world, G is going to stand for God's existence, and R is going to stand for the resurrection of Jesus. So again, what we're doing is we're assessing the intrinsic probability of the resurrection. So if you remember, that's the probability of the resurrection given the background knowledge of the world. So that's expressed by the following formula. We have a sum here, right? Two values that are being added together. The first is the probability of the resurrection given the existence of God and our background knowledge of the world, multiplied by the probability that God exists given the background knowledge of the world. So multiplied by the intrinsic probability of God's existence. Then we're going to add that to the following figure, which is comprised of the probability of the resurrection given that God does not exist and the background knowledge of the world, multiplied by the intrinsic probability of God not existing, right? That God doesn't exist given the background knowledge of the world. Now that whole second half can be eliminated, right? Because the probability that God raised Jesus from the dead, right, the resurrection, given that God doesn't exist, is of course going to be zero. And anything you multiply zero is also going to be zero. So you can forget about that whole second half. And so we can concentrate our analysis on that first half, right? On that first part of the sum. So the probability of the resurrection, given the background knowledge, that intrinsic probability of the resurrection, is going to be equal to the probability that God would raise Jesus from the dead, right, given that he exists, and our background knowledge of the world, multiplied by the intrinsic probability of God existing. Now we can include in B all of the data points that we always talk about, right, that serve as support for the existence of God, right, or even ones given, right, to show that God doesn't exist. So we can include in B things like the argument from contingency, right, the argument from fine-tuning, the argument from the applicability of mathematics, the argument from objective morality, and all of that. And we can also include, right, maybe the argument against God from evil, or the argument against God from hiddenness, right? So we're going to include all of that into our background knowledge of the world. And so let's say that if you put all of that together, and of course it's just conjecture here, right? But we'll say that the probability that God exists, given everything we know about the world, let's just say it's 0.5, right? So it's going to be 0.5. There's a 50% chance that God exists. So that takes care of that last part of the expression. What about that part right before it, that it's being multiplied against, right? The probability of the resurrection, given that God exists, right, and our background knowledge of the world. What does that mean? Well, basically what this means is the probability that God would raise Jesus from the dead, given that he exists and our background knowledge of the world. So how do we assess this? Well, God has never before intervened to do such a thing, and there are many other ways he could have vindicated Jesus' claims, and that's assuming he even wanted to, right? So we might think that the probability that God would raise Jesus from the dead might be low, right? But not so fast, right? Because the resurrecting of Jesus isn't this random event, right, in an otherwise chaotic world. This is in the context of the radical life of Jesus, right? So when you're looking at and examining a miracle, you need to consider the religio-historical context and the doctrinal context of that alleged miracle. When it comes to the resurrection, this is in light of, this comes at the end of an unparalleled life with unsurpassed teachings, with unbelievable radical personal claims, right, to be God. For example, Jesus is the only founder of a major world religion that claims to be God. And of course, his alleged miracles and exorcisms. And so when you think that, okay, we don't just have this evidence for any old body, but of a man who did and claimed all of these things, all of a sudden it doesn't seem so low that God would raise that man from the dead. Maybe that actually is the self-revelation of God. And so when B includes our knowledge of the life of Jesus, it seems hard to say that God deciding to raise Jesus, or that God would raise Jesus, is improbable, right? I see no reason at all to think that God wouldn't, right? Or that we can say that God wouldn't raise Jesus from the dead with a high degree of certainty. So it doesn't seem like we can say that it's dramatically or unimaginably improbable that God would raise Jesus from the dead. So let's say again it's something like 0.5. So the probability that God would raise Jesus from the dead, given that God exists and our background knowledge of the world, is 0.5. The intrinsic probability of God's existence, right? So the probability that God exists, given our background knowledge of the world, is also 0.5. So then, finally, we have our assessment, right? Our rudimentary assessment of the intrinsic probability of the resurrection. So the probability that that Jesus was raised to the dead from the dead by God, given everything we know about the world, is equal to 0.5 times 0.5, which is equal to 0.25. So that intrinsic improbability, right, can be easily counterbalanced by all the other factors in Bayes' theorem, right? Namely, the likelihood that you would see this evidence given the hypothesis that the resurrection actually occurred in comparison to the probability that you'd see that evidence given that the resurrection didn't occur, right? The explanatory power of the resurrection hypothesis compared to the explanatory power of all the naturalistic explanations. Now, remember what Hume was trying to do, right? He was trying to say that no matter how, right, no matter how strong, no matter how powerful, no matter how massive and plentiful your evidence was for a miracle, that improbability of it, right, the probability of the miracle occurring, that intrinsic probability, is going to be essentially zero, such that you are going to be comparing 50-50, right? But what we've seen here is that the intrinsic probability might not be as low. If it's something like 0.25, and then you multiply that by something very large, then you could come up with a numerator that is actually very large. So the funny thing is that Hume's, right, in principle argument against miracles is going to fail dramatically, right? It's going to fail in two important ways. One, you don't just consider the intrinsic probability, right? But two, the intrinsic probability need not even be terribly low. So Hume fails on all accounts. It's no surprise why philosophers have called his argument against miracles an abject failure. And of course, I have to add that the probability of the resurrection, right, given our background knowledge of the world, is going to be ultimately inscrutable, right? We're not going to actually be able to come up with a number there, right? Like, how would we ever be able to assess, right, what the probability is that God would raise Jesus from the dead, given that he existed and our background knowledge of the world? How can we say, like, what a free and rational agent like God would actually do and assign any probability to that? We ultimately can't. The point of this exercise here was to show that there's no reason to think that the probability that God would raise Jesus from the dead is terribly low. And frequency especially cannot be the justification here for thinking that that value is going to be terribly low, that God would raise Jesus from the dead because he has never raised people from the dead before. So therefore, we should think that isn't a means he would use to communicate a message. Because it may be, because such an event is so rare, that we would actually believe him, right? If God had used a different means to vindicate Jesus, like let's say surviving a lot of pain, that doesn't necessarily mean we should believe he's the revelation of God, because that's a natural event. That does happen from time to time, people surviving, right, crazy amounts of pain. But what doesn't happen, and indeed what can't happen without a supernatural intervention, is a man being raised from the dead, especially coming back in a glorified form. And so the idea that these resurrections are not commonplace is not going to be a good argument against the probability that God would choose the resurrection, would raise Jesus from the dead, given that he exists, and our knowledge of the world. And so, right, to summarize Hume's abject failure, the consequence of all of this is that there is no in principle argument against miracles. So Hume has, one, failed to show that any possible miracle claim has an insuperably low intrinsic probability. That's what we just talked about. But again, even incredibly low intrinsic probabilities can be outweighed by other factors in Bayes' theorem. So it's clear, right, why contemporary philosophers regard his project as a failure. Now, very quickly, I want to talk about, the atheists' favorite slogan. You'll hear this from people on Reddit all the way to, right, certain philosophers as well. And this is most clearly expressed by Carl Sagan, right? And this is the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? We've all heard this, right? This kind of line of thinking that says, if you're going to convince me of a claim that's so grand, that's so magnificent, then I'm going to need to see a magnificent amount of evidence. I'm going to need to see a whole ton of evidence if your hypothesis, if your claim is extraordinary. We've seen in today's investigation that that maxim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is false, right, as it's normally conceived of, right? In order to assess the probability of a claim, you don't need large amounts of evidence. All you need to show are those factors that we discussed, right, that make up the components of Bayes' theorem. The intrinsic probabilities and the posterior probabilities, right, the probabilities that you'd see that evidence, given that the claim is true versus if the claim wasn't true, right? So we don't need large amounts of evidence. We just need the numerator to be larger than the denominator in order to say that the event was probable. So the atheist's favorite phrase just is mathematically false. Now, remember, Hume had a second argument against miracles, which was his in fact argument. Now, remember, those were those four claims, right, why the miracles actually aren't all that strong, right, why they don't have a lot of evidence going for them, right, on analysis. Well, even if you concede that each of Hume's points have force, which I do, the relevant historical data concerning the miracle is still necessary in investigation of its authenticity. So yeah, maybe there are some reasons to be cautious, right, to be skeptical of any miracle claim. And I would agree with Hume that, yeah, we should be skeptical. But those reasons don't constitute a decisive disproof of identifying a miracle. They just, at best, invite caution. And so, yeah, maybe these are the case in most other miracle claims, but is the claim that Jesus rose from the dead like miracle claims in other religions, right? And as a matter of fact, even skeptics like the atheist philosopher Antony Flew have observed that there exists no other miracle in any other world religions that is supported by as much evidence as the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. He says the evidence for the resurrection is both quantitatively and qualitatively different. And so at the end of the day, we are still going to have to deal with the evidence for the resurrection. This is something that Hume wants to avoid, but it's going to be, as it turns out, an unavoidable question. And that's what we're going to spend the next 3 weeks after today talking about. So in conclusion, miracles are not only possible, but are additionally able to be identified and believed by rational and scientifically informed men. And indeed, God has verified his revelation to mankind with the miracle of all miracles, the resurrection of his Son from the dead. As Acts reads, "In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead."